Barry Julian Eichengreen is an American economist holding the title of the Pardee Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of UC Berkeley, where he has taught since 1987. I've read through his bio, and he has received many advanced degrees, culminating in a PhD from Yale. Trust me, you need to know the guy's smart. PhD from Yale. Eichengreen currently is serving as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and is a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Dr. Eichengreen, take it away.
Thank you, Ken. So I mentioned to Ken the other day that I'm a big fan of the work of the Harvard political scientist, Robert Putnam, whose famous book is called Bowling Alone. It's about the importance of civic organizations in American life. He's referring to bowling leagues in the title of his book, but I would include economic clubs as well. I think there really is an important civic purpose to these kind of organizations which exist in order to encourage constructive discussion of economic problems and issues. So I know what you're all thinking. You're wondering whether it's safe to have a book with this title on your bookshelves. And I'm here to convince you that, yes, it is. The book is co-authored with, as you can see, with Asma El-Ghanani, who's an economist at the International Monetary Fund, and two other professors, Rui Esteves at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and Chris Michener, who is down the road from me at Santa Clara University. The jumping off point is concern about the question of whether our government debt, our public debt, is out of control. It's important to put that concern in historical perspective. So I think this issue rose to public consciousness in the 1980s. And there are good historical reasons for that I'll come back to. But the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the Washington-based lobby organization that warns against excessive debt, was created in 1981. The National Debt Clock, which you can see in Times Square, was mounted on a wall of a building there in 1989. So this is an issue that people began to grow concerned about in the 1980s, and that they've been concerned about ever since, the worrying being that government spending and debt have been spiraling dangerously out of control. So that awareness was widespread up until the end of the most recent decade. And then, of course, came COVID-19, which led governments around the world and first and foremost, the US government, to run unprecedented deficits and accumulate unprecedented debts, unprecedented at least in peacetime. There's an important historical association between war and the rise in public debts that I'll come back to in a moment. But you will know, I presume, that the US federal government deficit is currently about 13% of national income, unprecedented during peacetime, and debt in the hands of the public, in other words, excluding debt held, US Treasury securities held by the Social Security Fund and so forth, debt in the hands of the public now exceeds 100% of GDP for the first time since the immediate aftermath of World War II. Is this increase in federal spending and rise in debt ratios justified? I think virtually all economists would answer yes. Extraordinary circumstances, like those of a global pandemic, justify extraordinary action. And a government that doesn't respond to this kind of economic emergency and public health emergency by pulling out all the stops would not long retain its legitimacy. So I think economists would agree that there is a sound argument for governments to mobilize all available resources in response to this existential crisis, including resources that can only be mobilized in the short run by borrowing, by issuing debt. Indeed, if you look at the history, and our book is devoted to 2 millennia of public debt history, you will see that states and rulers have long borrowed to meet emergencies, to fight offensive and especially defensive wars, to borrow to meet public health emergencies, pandemics. The government of the city-state of Venice famously borrowed in order to meet the emergency created by the Black Death when it arrived on its shores. But in the context of war, borrowing to mount a sturdy national defense strengthens the state in the material sense of its ability to successfully repel invaders, but it also enhances the political legitimacy of the state, because a state that can provide a sturdy national defense and protect its residents against hostile invaders gains legitimacy in the eyes of that public. So rulers have long borrowed for military-related purposes which in turn means that public debt history is European history. So Europe is distinctive historically in that it was divided into literally hundreds of princely kingdoms, small territorial states, city-states, and so forth that were butted up against one another, that repeatedly came into military conflict. So that political geography followed from Europe's physical geography as a continent divided, riven by mountain ranges and river valleys, making it difficult to form extensive territorial states. Contrast China, which the Himalayas to the west notwithstanding is a great plain and was unified already 2,300 years ago under the Qing dynasty. Europe is different in that it was divided into all these different territorial states. European history is the history of war, and that's in essence why public debt, markets in public debt, the issuance of public debt develops in Europe before it develops anywhere else in the world. It develops when kings, the sovereign who occupied the throne, was able to solve his or her commitment problem. So the king or the sovereign was the supreme earthly power, the embodiment of the state. Louis XIV, when he said, "The state is me," sounds better in French, made that point. But the unlimited power of the king or the sovereign, in turn, limited his ability to borrow because there was nothing preventing him from repudiating his debt obligations. So it followed that sovereigns could borrow only for relatively short periods and only at high interest rates until they solved that political problem. So you see interest rates on public debt, on sovereign debt, 2 terms that economists use to describe the same thing. Those interest rates come down with the development of political checks and balances on arbitrary action by the sovereign or the executive. So you see those checks and balances develop in the form of representative assemblies, legislatures, and parliaments, first in compact city-states like Florence, Genoa, Venice, where it's possible to get the relevant players, the creditors, important businessmen together in one room. And then you see it develop subsequently in territorial states like the Netherlands and England. So I show you the case of Holland from 1600 to 1750, which was the period when they created their representative assembly, the Estates General. And you can see how the real inflation adjusted, in other words, interest rate on borrowing by the state came down from like 8% at the beginning of the period to less than 2% at the end, as public debt comes to be recognized as an obligation of the state rather than of the individual, of the sovereign occupying the throne. So that political precondition had to be put in place, and economic preconditions had to be put in place as well. Not only did interest rates have to come down, but the growth rate of the economy had to go up as well. So when economists think about the sustainability of public debt, they look at the difference between the interest rate on the debt, R, and the growth rate of the economy, G. If the economy is growing faster, government's revenues are growing faster, its ability to support a larger debt in absolute terms is growing as well. And you can see here in the period of the Industrial Revolution and the transition to modern economic growth, how not only are interest rates paid on public debt coming down, but the growth rate of the advanced economies with the Industrial Revolution and so forth is going up. And at the same time, there have to be savings to invest in debt securities. So it's not a coincidence that the states that are the public debt pioneers were also major naval and commercial powers in their day, ranging from Venice and Genoa to the Netherlands and Great Britain, all mentioned a moment ago. And finally, states have to put in place financial preconditions in order to develop a market in public debt, to have trading of government securities. The market has to be liquid, and there has to be an institution to provide liquidity. When liquidity grows scarce, we call those institutions central banks. Here I show you the original facade of the Bank of England, created in, I believe, 1688, coincident with the rise of a market in public debt securities in England, with spillovers to private markets. So there's a large literature in economic history on what's called the Great Divergence. If you look back in history, the technological leader was arguably China rather than the West for many centuries. Yet starting in the 19th century, there was a great divergence when the West underwent a transition to more rapid, sustained economic growth, and the rest, including China, did not. What accounts for that great divergence? Part of the answer is we developed financial markets. And part of the reason we developed financial markets was the growth of a market in public debt, which was a safe and liquid asset that served as collateral that people could put up as collateral when they sought to borrow from other parties for other purposes. So the argument in the book is that the development of a market in public debt and the development of private financial markets kind of go together. So over time, the uses of public debt have evolved. I emphasized before the association of public debt issuance with wars, and I show you that association here for the case of the United States. And you can see that debt as a share of GDP, which is what's plotted on the vertical axis here, the evolution of that ratio has been punctuated historically in the United States by the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. But over time, the uses to which public debt has been put, the reasons that government has borrowed, those reasons have evolved, not only to finance offensive and defensive wars, but starting in the 19th century to promote economic development. to invest in the roads, railways, ports, urban lighting, sewer systems associated with modern economic growth. And in the 20th century, governments have borrowed also to finance social programs and transfer payments, as you well know. So we're having a debate in the United States about these things at the moment. Economists would argue that it is sensible to borrow in order to invest in productive infrastructure that will grow the economy over time. Through that channel, augment the government's revenues and enhance its ability to service and repay that very debt that it's issuing today. So the argument would be, my argument to Senator Manchin would be that it is sensible to borrow to invest in roads and bridges that will make for a more efficient and larger US economy over time, grow the government's tax revenues and enhance its ability to service and repay that very debt. It doesn't make sense to borrow in order to finance transfer payments. And we have seen that last, less healthy tendency over time as well. And I think that last tendency reflects mainly growing political polarization combined with electoral uncertainty. So we see that from the Democrats in the Congress at the moment. So I live in the People's Republic of Berkeley. You can guess my political affiliation, but I see the Democrats in Congress trying to rush through their preferred social programs and to borrow in part in order to do it because of fear of losing the ability to do so after the midterm elections. So when the different parties have very different views of what desirable spending programs are, and they fear losing office in the next election, they will borrow in order to spend now and worry about the consequences later. And I think we have seen that tendency increasing over time in the United States because of the growing political polarization that we as a country have experienced. So now we have COVID-19, and I think the question everybody is asking is whether we have seen a sea change in views of how expansive our government should be, and whether we should be borrowing to invest in pre-K and public health and other things that will arguably make for a more productive labor force 15 or 20 years from now, a larger economy, therefore, more revenues for the government, and greater ability of that government to service and repay that debt, or whether arguments that COVID is an exceptional event that hasn't really changed those old attitudes will be the dominant view. That's apparently what we're now hearing from the moderates in the Congress. There is an argument that the change in attitudes about how expansive government should be predates COVID-19. There was growing concern about inequality, obviously, Occupy Wall Street and all that prior to COVID-19. I think there was growing recognition of the need for government to provide support spending on education, healthcare, basic research, transportation infrastructure, climate change abatement, things that markets left to their own devices don't adequately supply. So it could be that having swung from the New Deal order of the 1930s to the neoliberal order of the 1980s, we're now swinging back to a kind of New Deal order as a result of COVID and pre-COVID concern about inequality. The other thing that has changed, of course, is that interest rates have come down. They've come down enormously, which makes it easier for the government to service and repay debt. So I show you here government interest payments on the debt as a share of GDP. Look how enormously they've come down. This is really a remarkable figure that since the turn of the century, public debt in the hands of the public as a share of GDP has tripled. Yet our interest payments are no higher than they were in year 2000. And they're only half of what they were in the 1980s. Interest rates have come down in the United States, and they've come down worldwide, which is one reason why a lot of economists are a bit more relaxed about our high public debt ratios than they would have been otherwise. There's no guarantee, obviously, that interest rates, having come down, will stay down. And if they go back up, stabilizing our debt ratio and bringing it down will become more urgent. Historically, governments have brought down heavy debt burdens in three ways: by running budget surpluses and retiring debt, by growing the economy, in other words, growing the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio, and by running inflation, which also grows the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio in a less healthy way. Let me show you a couple of examples of what governments have done historically. Britain emerged from the French and Napoleonic Wars in 1820 with a public debt ratio of 200% of GDP. Recall, I told you earlier, the US has a debt in the hands of the public of 100% of GDP. So here's a case of public debt twice as high relative to the scale of the economy. Look at this remarkable figure. Over a century, the country brought down its debt ratio from 200% of GDP to basically nothing. And it did it by running government budget surpluses year after year for a full century, with the sole exception of 1 year, 1901, when they were fighting the Boer War. How did they do that? I think for two reasons. Number one, because the creditors were dominant in the parliament. Only men of property, landowners basically, could vote and sit in parliament for most of the 19th century. And number two, the Brits could see another war coming at some point, maybe with the French, maybe with the Germans. So they wanted to restore their capacity to borrow to meet the next emergency. Let me show you another amazing figure, this one for the United States after our Civil War. So we started with a debt to GDP ratio of about 30%, and we basically extinguished that debt by the eve of World War I, by 1913. Again, by running budget surpluses year after year after year. So the subtext here is, do you think we in the United States, with our political polarization, our fractious politics, our electoral uncertainty, could run budget surpluses for the next 50 years in order to extinguish our debt? So I think this history is useful for thinking about what is distinctive about today and what kind of economic as well as political challenges it poses going forward. There are other not so happy cases of Britain in the 1920s with polarized politics, and now the universal franchise, which couldn't agree on how to run budget surpluses and bring down the debt, and Germany, which suffered a hyperinflation after World War I. And you can see how the debt was liquidated. The creditors were liquidated, if you will, by totally inflating away the debt. An example clearly we would not want to replicate. And after World War II, the US and Europe were able to bring down high debt ratios basically by growing our economies very rapidly by historical standards. twice as rapidly as any period before or any period since. So rapid growth solves many problems, and it solves the problem of inherited debts as well, if you're lucky enough to have rapid economic growth. So I want to conclude with a series of questions about what we're capable of doing as a society going forward. Are we capable of running large budget surpluses year after year after year as a way of retiring our debt? With a co-author, I looked for historical cases where economies had been able to run budget surpluses as large as 5% of GDP for as long as 10 consecutive years. Such cases are almost non-existent. We could find 3 in the 20th century. Norway, after 1999, they discovered immense amounts of oil and gas in the North Sea. So they sucked those surpluses away for future generations. Singapore, with its impeccably strong technocratic government in kind of a geopolitically delicate part of the world, which wants to put reserves aside for contingencies. And Belgium, which was the most heavily indebted country in Europe in 1995, even more heavily indebted than Greece or Italy, that was desperate to get into the euro area when it was created in 1999, and therefore had to run budget surpluses to signal to its European partners that it would be a prudent member of the monetary union. So the subtext here is, under normal circumstances, governments cannot run surpluses alone to solve their debt problems. Are we poised to inflate away the debt? There are some economists, like my English friend Charles Goodhart, who believe inflation is coming. I'm skeptical. I think investors can see the possibility, and they will shift to short maturity debt, treasury bills rather than bonds. If they suspect inflation is coming, the Fed would have to surprise investors repeatedly with higher inflation for this to begin to inflate away the debt. I think the creditors' lobby of insurance companies, mutual funds, pension funds that would be expropriated by inflation is strong. I think stability culture is deeply ingrained in today's central banking community, including the Fed. So I can imagine 3 or 4% inflation for a couple of years, but not higher inflation, which of a sort that would be needed to make a serious dent in the debt problem. And finally, what about faster growth? We have seen something of a digital revolution as a result of COVID. Here we are on Zoom, right? But these kind of new general purpose technologies that diffuse to many sectors of the economy and translate into faster productivity growth take a long time to show up in the productivity statistics. All kinds of businesses have to adapt how they go about their everyday lives in order to significantly boost productivity. So this was true of the steam engine. I show you a picture at the top of the internal combustion engine, of the personal computer. It took 10 years and longer for the diffusion of these new technologies and the adaptation of the private sector to their availability to show up in terms of faster productivity growth. So I don't think faster productivity growth alone is going to bail us out of this problem either. So my conclusion is that there are no simple solutions to our inherited debt problem. History shows that countries that have successfully addressed problems of debt sustainability without experiencing major economic, financial, and political dislocations have done so by turning to fiscal restraint, which means balancing the budget when the time is right, when recovery from the immediate crisis is secure, by successfully growing their economies, by growing the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio, and by avoiding deflation, maybe even by running modest 2 or 3% rates of inflation. So the core conclusion of the book is that failing to address the problem from all three angles is a recipe for failure. It's a recipe for disaster. It's going to be hard. I think getting to where we are today was unavoidable, given the nature of the COVID economic and health emergency, but it's restoring our capacity to borrow to meet the next emergency, the next novel coronavirus or climate disaster or whatever, restoring that capacity will be a challenge. So I thank you for your attention.
All right. By the way, please continue sending in those questions. They've been terrific. They're coming from about 4 or 5 people, which is wonderful for those 4 or 5. But if you have a question, don't be shy. Even if it's a bad question or you think it's a poorly worded question, send it to me. I'll take your concept and word it into a question as poorly as you would have. But this way, I'll own any of the bad oration. Okay, but let's get started with the questions we have. First of all, you mentioned your political leanings, Professor Eichengreen. And I want to tell you my observation of your political leanings are, one, you live in Berkeley, which means you must be liberal, but you called it the People's Republic, which means you must be conservative. But then you talk about paying for current services with taxes and borrowing for capital spending. As Dr. Miller makes the astute observation, you seem to be from the Chicago school. So I think what we're really talking about here is you're an economist. So I think you're excused from having a political leaning here. Okay, so now this question comes in from Bill. Bill wants to know, well, you mentioned borrowing for transfer payments. First of all, before we go into that, can you describe for our audience what you mean by transfer payments?
So by transfer payments, I simply mean transferring income from one segment of society to another. So during the COVID pandemic, we saw relief checks being sent to households with household incomes less than $150,000 typically. So that is borrowing in order to transfer income to a certain set of recipients. Thanks for reminding me to define my terms.
Well, that's okay. The reason I do that is because there was another question where someone was asking, what was your position on borrowing for social subsidies, and what do you think has been the effect on growth as a result of rewarding people or subsidizing people for not working?
So there's a very large literature with conflicting findings in empirical economics about the incentive effects of different government programs and different kinds of transfer payments. I think it's important to look at specific cases. So let's talk about COVID-19. I think the evidence is still coming in, but I think the evidence on, well, number one, early on in COVID, we wanted people not to work in order to stay safe and avoid infection rates rising uncontrollably. Now that we have vaccines and therapies, we want people to go back to work, and the question becomes salient again. We have seen a significant number of people drop out of the labor force temporarily. And the question is, have they dropped out because they've had to stay home and take care of children who haven't been in school? Have they dropped out because they received those relief checks in the mail? Or have they dropped out because some people have begun to rethink their lifestyles as a result of the COVID experience? And I think there is some evidence of all three of those things happening. My view is that there may have been a small negative effect of the relief checks on labor force participation, which is the immediate incentive effect that I think it was Bill you said was asking about, but that the entire decline in labor force participation that we've seen is not a result of that single factor. There have been other things at work as well.
Terry's asking, would you please just quickly remind everybody the difference between public versus private debt?
So public debt is debt issued by the government. Private debt is your mortgage, your company's borrowings, etc.
Okay, now there's a lot of questions coming in, all dancing around the same thing. So if I didn't ask your question exactly, I'm grabbing the subject from Daniel and Neil and Steve and Jason. They're all dancing around the same idea. Now, first off, the question is how much debt is healthy? Now, I know you mentioned in your conversation, your presentation, that the debt is not as important as the interest payments compared to GDP and the sustainability of them. But considering where we are with interest rates and rising interest rates, how much debt is healthy, and at what point does it become unhealthy?
So about 15 years ago, there appeared a famous, much commented upon book called "This Time is Different," where the authors argued that there was a specific numerical answer to your question, namely, once debt rises above 90% of national income, it becomes a real problem from a variety of different angles, and you don't want to go there. I think that view was discredited, and unfortunately, I have to give you the economist's answer, which is how much debt is healthy, or at what point does debt become a problem? The answer is it depends. That's the two-handed economist's answer on the one hand, on the other hand. And it depends specifically on those factors that I was talking about in my presentation. If the interest rate is now lower, a higher level of debt is safe and can be serviced by the government without crowding out other valuable public investment projects. If the economy is growing more slowly, then the same level of public debt is more of a problem because the government's revenues are not going to be growing as rapidly in the future. If that debt is being incurred for good reasons to finance productive investment in infrastructure, for example, then a higher level of debt for the moment is safe. If the government is borrowing to finance its current spending, on the other hand, as opposed to its current investment, or if it's investing unproductively, then the same level of debt is a problem. So that's the general principle. Don't focus on a number. But as I do my debt arithmetic and I look at the interest rates and growth rates and likelihood of future problems in the United States, I think we do need to bring down our debt to GDP ratio because we know that bad things happen more frequently than we used to think. We had a global financial crisis in 2008. We had a global pandemic in 2020. We don't know whether the next emergency is going to be a geopolitical event or another novel coronavirus or a climate-related event or another financial crisis. Many things could happen, and I think we need to enhance the ability of the government to meet that next emergency if and when it comes. And that means lowering the inherited debt to GDP ratio. So those are the general principles, which I think are a better way of thinking about it than focusing on a number.
Now, you had mentioned, and I quote, extraordinary events require extraordinary reactions. And absolutely, it's hard to argue that. But every single government, when we have a new administration, everything is extraordinary for them. And the idea is that you're supposed to save for a rainy day, except it's raining every day in Washington, D.C. So how do you, when you sit with the bureaus where you're doing research and where you make policy recommendations, how do you try to couch politicians with restraint? And have you ever had any success in doing so?
Well, the short period, the year plus I spent in Washington was in the 1990s. And the one period when the United States has been able to bring down its debt to GDP ratio pretty dramatically was between 1993 and 2000. So I don't have to mention anybody's names, but there was one administration that did succeed in running primary budget surpluses for the better part of 2 terms in office. So it can be done. I do think it's, as I said before, it's harder now because of political polarization. There has to be something of a consensus between the 2 political parties on the desirability of fiscal consolidation in a period when the economy is expanding. And that's much harder today than it was 20 years ago.
So Richard brings up a very good point. Elsewhere around the world, U.S. states do have the opportunity to raise their own debt, as well as cities, whereas elsewhere around the world they don't. So should states and munis debt be included in the aggregate public debt? Because we're comparing ourselves to other country. And when we look at our public debt in this conversation, we're only talking about the federal debt. Yeah, is that something that should be recouched?
Yeah, so we need to, for a complete picture, I think it is important to think about state and municipal debt as well. So state debts are not very heavy in the United States because most 49 of 50 states have balanced budget laws or amendments of one sort or another. So when the state of California, I don't know about Nevada, you'll have to tell me, but when the state of California wants to spend more than it takes in, it has to turn to its rainy day fund. In other words, if it ran surpluses in the past, it can put the excess revenues aside as a rainy day fund and draw them down as it did in 2020. Municipalities do borrow, and they do sometimes go through bankruptcy proceedings as a result. Orange County, City of Detroit, et cetera. So the picture does change a bit when we look at the general government, which means federal, state, municipal, and especially when we think about unfunded pension liabilities, which are a big part of what municipalities and states owe their creditors going forward.
Well, and you had asked, Nevada does have to balance its budget every 2 years. So the budget runs for 2 years. You can run a deficit in year 1 as long as you pay it back in year 2. So here's an interesting question. Neil, thank you for this question. There's a lot of debate about inflation. Well, there's not a lot of debate. There is a lot of inflation, I think is a better way to say it. But is Build Back Better expected to be inflationary, considering the situation in fiscal and monetary policy over the last 18 months?
There's a big debate about that at the moment. So my personal engagement with that debate is I had a little Twitter exchange with Jason Furman, who's at Harvard now and was Obama's economic advisor yesterday, where he said he worries about Build Back Better being inflationary. And I don't, because the federal government deficit before Build Back Better is forecast by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office to go down from 13% of GDP this year to 4.5% of GDP next year. So that's taking away 9% of spending at one fell swoop between this year and next year. And Build Back Better will add back in maybe 0.5% if you assume that Build Back Better will be half financed by taxes and half financed by borrowing, which is what I assume. And if you remember that Build Back Better will be spread over 10 years. So it's relatively small by the grand scheme of things. So I am worried about inflation because I worry that the Fed is a bit behind the curve, and everybody sees how high inflation is running right now. But I expect the Fed to begin to catch up next year. I expect some of the supply chain problems that we're suffering at the moment. So prices are going up partly because the shelves are bare in a lot of stores because we can't get the containers unloaded at the Port of Long Beach and the goods trucked to Las Vegas. I expect those problems to be sorted out by next year as well. So I'm still of the view that the current high rate of inflation will begin to moderate next year.
So you had mentioned there were three ways to strategically tackle a high deficit. One was to pay down the debt by running a surplus, which seems unlikely in this partisan environment. Two was to inflate away the debt because the debt stays stable. If you inflate your economy, you have a bigger pile of money to pay down a fixed debt. But that's also not terribly healthy. Although there might be some value in letting inflation run a little bit for a little while. But three was to grow the economy. And it seems like number 2 and 3 make the most sense. But I'm now about to weave a whole bunch of questions together. It seems like public debt is good when used to invest in economic growth, as long as the growth outpaces the debt payment. If we're growing our GDP at a 2% growth rate, which seems to be where we're headed, and from your chart that you showed earlier, is the long-term average before we had that period of extraordinary growth after World War II, is that really a viable strategy to try to grow away our debt?
Well, I think the growth rate of the US economy is potential growth is above 2%, somewhere between 2 and 3%. Let's say 2.5%. And historically, the interest rate adjusted for inflation, the real interest rate has been about 2% as well. So I think it is. And at the moment, the real interest rate is way below that, right? Nominal interest rates, the interest rate you read about in the newspaper on government bonds is 1%. And inflation is, pick your favorite number, 5 or 6%. So the real inflation adjusted interest rate is negative. The economy is growing and the real interest rate the government pays on its debt is negative. So if interest rates remain where they are, yes, it's a realistic possibility to outgrow the debt burden, but that's a big if, right? And there's a lot of debate out there about what's going to happen. If you look at what the markets think is going to happen, you look at the implicit, you look at the treasury yields, treasury futures 10 years out. Investors think that interest rates are going to remain slightly above where they are at the moment, but only slightly. So I think there is some scope, if interest rates behave, for growing our way in part out from under this debt burden.
Ever the economist, Professor Eichengreen, you gave us some optimism and then tempered it right away. Okay, well, The questions keep coming in, but guys, I think we've gotten to a really great stopping point. It sounds like there is an opportunity for the U.S. government to grow the economy faster than the deficit, or at least faster than the interest payments, and that's wonderful to hear. Hopefully, a little bit of bipartisan restraint would be helpful. So go speak to your congressmen and senators about that one as well. Pardon me, congresspersons. Thank you for that. You guys are fast on that. Lastly, I'd like to remind everybody that Professor Eichengreen's book, In Defense of Public Debt, is available. And Jason Sadow just put a link out to everybody. So go ahead, if you click that link and use this promo code, you can go ahead and save 30%. And Dr. Eichengreen, thank you for your time today. Thank you for fielding these questions. And guys, those questions were great. They were coming in from, in the end, about 10 or 15 different people, and they were all over the place. So good stuff, everybody, and thank you again. The next event will be on December 14th, where we will have Chief Economist Beth Ann Bovino from Standard & Poor's and John Sylvia, who is, I believe, more of a comedic economic comedian these days, but they'll be discussing their outlook for the end of 21 and beginning of 2022. So thank you, everybody, and have a fantastic day. Thank you again, Professor Eichengreen.
And thank you to Ken and Jason and everyone.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody.